Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Jack Malde, Associate Director at the Bipartisan Policy Center. In this week's episode, BPC Senior Advisor Theresa Cardinal delves into some summer 2024 events in immigration policy and politics. First, on the policy side, on June 18th, President Biden announced an executive order that, in addition to helping undocumented spouses of US citizens, aimed to streamline the D3 waiver process for foreign-born college graduates and DACA recipients to help them obtain work visas. We welcome immigration lawyer Dan Berger to take us through this change. On the political side, on July 15th, Donald Trump chose his running mate as junior senator from Ohio, J.D. Vance. Then, on July 21st, President Joe Biden announced he would no longer be seeking re-election, and the following day endorsed his Vice President, Kamala Harris, as his heir apparent for the next term. Theresa and I discuss how these events might impact immigrants and immigration policy. One thing can be said for sure: we live in times of large and rapid transitions. Stay tuned.
On June 18th, President Biden announced an executive order to streamline the D3 waiver process for foreign-born graduates and DACA recipients. The D3 waiver, which allows certain undocumented immigrants, including DACA recipients, to obtain temporary work visas, will see updated guidance for consular officers to expedite processing and better coordination between State Department and the Department of Homeland Security, who both play a role in this process. The executive order highlights the vital contributions of these individuals to the U.S. workforce and economy. Sounds simple, but the fact is that even though this waiver and process has been in law for quite some time, it's complex and difficult to navigate. So let's try to understand the new policy, how it affects the lives of immigrants, what a D3 is, how it works, why it needed an update. So to do so, I'm happy to welcome our guest, my friend and colleague from Cornell Law School, Dan Berger. Dan is an immigration lawyer and partner at Curran Berger & Clute in Northampton, Massachusetts, and an honorary fellow of the American Academy of Adoption Attorneys. He serves on several legal advisory boards and committees related to immigration and adoption. He frequently writes and speaks on immigration issues, contributing to various publications and media outlets. He's a fellow with me at Cornell Law School, and he focuses on DACA and undocumented students. So welcome to the podcast, Dan.
Thanks very much, Theresa. Nice to be here.
So to start, I think we need to explain to our audience what a D3 waiver is. Why was it created and how does it work?
Sure. I will try to do that. And I've been practicing over the last month or so trying to explain it in the simplest possible way. I guess, but before I do that, I just want to say that it isn't simple because the D3 waiver is one piece of the process. And so it may take a little bit of time. I don't have a nice, simple talking point like work visas for undocumented spouses of U.S. citizens, which is
it's hard to shorthand this. I get it. Yeah.
Exactly. And even the White House announcement on June 18th had 4 paragraphs about spouses and 1 paragraph at the bottom that didn't really explain this very well. So basically, most individuals who have DACA or who are undocumented and have graduated from a U.S. institution have some kind of unlawful presence. And as your listeners may know, unlawful presence means days in the U.S. over the age of 18 without permission. And so that would be time spent without DACA. So, for example, it could be somebody who got DACA over age 18 and a half, or it could be somebody who was never able to get DACA and is fully undocumented. If people have more than 6 months or a year of unlawful presence, they are in a catch-22 because the only way to move into status through employer sponsorship is to travel and apply for a new visa, but there is either a 3 or 10-year bar to return based on that unlawful presence. So what the D3 waiver does is it waives that 3 or 10-year bar, and it opens up the possibility for people who are on DACA or undocumented to be able to travel and move into status through employer sponsorship.
Yeah, so they would go abroad, which ordinarily would trigger this bar and not let them come back in any status for these 3 years or 10 years. It would waive that and allow them to come back with a visa in a lawful status, correct?
That's right. That's exactly right. Yes.
Okay. So you said a little bit about this, but let's dive into a little bit more. Who are the eligible candidates for a D3 waiver and who might not be able to use it? So D3 waives the unlawful presence, but is it for somebody who's trying to get a green card or somebody who's trying to get a temporary work visa? Who could benefit from this?
A D3 waiver is only for people applying for temporary working visas. So this would be, the most common would be an H-1B, but it could be almost any kind of temporary working visa.
Right. So if somebody is maybe trying to get a green card based on marriage to a citizen or a family preference, this wouldn't necessarily help them.
Absolutely. And there really is no one size fits all. So when we do screenings for individuals, we're looking at all different options. Immigration is a game of categories. And some people, for some people, the best option short term will be moving on to a temporary visa and using the D3 waiver.
Right. So I think the probably easiest way for our audience to understand is to kind of walk through maybe a typical case of somebody who could use this. Let's start with somebody who has DACA, maybe had some time in unlawful presence before they got DACA, so they would be subject to these bars. They've graduated from a U.S. university, and they're lucky enough, maybe they're working for somebody already who's willing to sponsor them for a work visa, or they're going to get a work visa. Can you walk us through what the process looks like for that person now? And then we'll get to how the announcement changed it.
Sure. So I think through Cornell Law School, we have a project called Path to Papers, where we have a clinic that's based on thinking about employer-sponsored options for Dreamers. So we've been trying a pilot test. We've been doing some cases even before this announcement to see what we could learn and report back to the administration about where the pain points are. So I'll give you an example. Last November, a hospital in New England sponsored an emergency medicine doctor who was on DACA for an H-1B. The H-1B was approved. Because he was on DACA, he couldn't just change in the US from DACA to H-1B. So that H-1B approval was sent electronically to all the US consulates in the world. He then traveled. He asked for the D3 waiver at the consulate, and that D3 waiver is still pending. So he had to return. Thankfully, he had advance parole. He had a pre-approved travel document from his DACA, but that D3 waiver is still pending. So that's an example of what happens without the president's plan, is that there is an employer, he's sponsored for an H-1B, he could move into status, but it takes so long that it would keep him out of his job. And we don't it is subjective, so we don't necessarily have certainty that it will be approved.
Right. And so in the meantime, he comes back on advance parole. He resumes his DACA status. And advance parole, for anybody who doesn't understand, is you apply to the government for permission to leave and come back when you otherwise wouldn't have any ability to come back. So you're paroled, you're allowed to come back into the country in advance of your departure. That's what advance parole means. And DACA recipients can get this for specific purposes to leave the country. So in this case, he's got an approved H-1B petition. But he may not be able to use it. How long is that H-1B petition valid? Does it expire at some point if he can't get a visa?
Well, an H-1B is valid for 3 years, but if anything changes in his job along the way, if he gets promoted or moves to a new position or moves laterally even, then that H-1B would no longer be good. So as a practical matter, most folks with DACA who have advanced parole, and especially people who are undocumented, we're not using this pathway, right, because it's too uncertain and too long.
Let's game this out for a little bit. Suppose that the D3 waiver had been approved for this person, or does the consulate approve the waiver, or does the consulate recommend the waiver? Who actually issues the waiver in the government? What would happen next?
Yeah. So it's really an interagency process. The U.S. Immigration Service approves the H-1B. The consular officer, which is part of the State Department, the consular officer recommends the waiver to Customs and Border Protection, and they have an office near DC called the Admissibility Review Office. So basically, the embassy or the consulate recommends the waiver to CBP. CBP issues authorization back to the embassy to issue the visa, and then the embassy issues the visa. So it really is an interagency process all the way through.
Thank you for walking us through that. I think it's really important for people to kind of understand what the process looks like. So we have two agencies, one part of DHS at the beginning to approve the H-1B, consular offices who are part of State Department to recommend the waiver. then Customs and Border Protection, another part of DHS, that would approve the waiver for somebody to come back. I want to clarify something else that has come up, I think, as discussions. It's talked about a lot in terms of DACA recipients, but are DACA recipients the only potential beneficiaries of this process, or are there other people who may have these bars that could benefit?
Other people do have the bars and could benefit. So the way the guidance was written and the president made his announcement on June 18th, promised a 30-day rollout. I have to give the State Department a lot of credit that it's hard to do anything in 30 days. And within 30 days, they updated their guidance in their own policy manual, the Foreign Affairs Manual, and that came out last Monday. So what the guidance said was that anyone who is a graduate of a U.S. institution, a U.S. institution of higher education, and who is the beneficiary of a work visa petition, can benefit. So I think there are something like 530,000 people with DACA now. So this is something that they should be screened for, because DACA is, was never meant to be a permanent solution. And the numbers really surprised me. There are roughly over 400,000 people who are in higher education today who are fully undocumented. So these are people who we hope will graduate, will have a degree, and be unable to work and use that U.S. higher education. There are also, from my understanding, about 200,000 people who would be eligible for DACA, but have not been able to access it because new DACA applications have been on hold with the courts. So you're talking about actually, roughly 600,000 people who are fully undocumented, and over 500,000 people with DACA. So really over 1 million people who could potentially be screened for this remedy.
Yeah, so let's just revisit what the requirements to use this process are. You have to be subject to the 3 or 10-year bars because of unlawful presence. You have to have graduated with a degree from a U.S. Institute of Higher Education, so that usually means a bachelor's degree or higher, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have to have an approved employment-based non-immigrant visa petition, so a temporary work visa petition that oftentimes would be H-1B. It could theoretically be an L, which is for intercompany transferees, or maybe an E visa from one of the countries that have an E visa that is kind of like an H-1B, but not.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe a Canadian or a Mexican who could get a TN. Is that another option there too, right?
It could be. So in law we talk about a safe harbor. And the H-1B and the L-1 are safe harbors because those don't require any hint of temporary intent. So
Right.
The fact that somebody has lived in the U.S. most of their life is not an issue at all.
Right.
For the other types of visas, that's being discussed, I think. And over the past few years, the administration has updated some of the guidance on e-visas, TN visas, R1, which is religious worker visas. And as I've gotten into this work, there are a surprising number of people in divinity school who are undocumented or DACA.
Oh, wow, there you go.
And then the O1 visa for individuals of extraordinary ability. And all of those have kind of a quasi dual intent where somebody can be coming long-term, but it is a temporary visa. And we're figuring that out as we go along.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm gonna dive into that real quickly here, because again, we have a lot of people who don't know the system as well as you, or maybe I do.
Mm-hmm.
Most non-immigrant visas require you to demonstrate to the consular officer that you don't intend to permanently move to the United States. And so because it's a non-immigrant, not an immigrant visa, certain categories of non-immigrant visas, the ones Dan just mentioned, by statute don't have that requirement, the L and the H. Others still have the requirement, but there's more flexibility in whether or not it's applied in a given circumstance. It has something what they call dual intent. You can both intend to come temporarily and later immigrant, and that's still fine. So this is where, just full disclosure, anybody who's thinking that, hey, this might qualify, I might qualify for this, go find an immigration attorney. Go find an immigration attorney who understands this process, somebody like Dan who can help walk you through it. Don't presume that you can do this one on your own, because it's really complicated. Dan, so we walked through sort of what the process might look like. You talked about the different agencies. And of course, the case that you told us, it didn't work out. He had to come back and couldn't get the non-immigrant visa. What exactly did Biden's executive order change, and why was it needed?
So it was very much needed because people don't want to travel unless there is some certainty that the waiver will be approved and that the waiver will be approved in a reasonable amount of time. And those are the two changes that were made. There is now I won't use the word presumption, but there is now guidance that says that if somebody has graduated from a U.S. institution and is subject to the 3 and 10 year bar and has a work visa application pending, that it is in the public interest to grant the waiver and to expedite the waiver. For years, it has said waivers can be approved and waivers can be expedited in the public interest, but there was no real explanation of what public interest meant. And in the past, in a very few cases, we've made that argument and it has been successful. And I hope we would all agree that allowing people who have graduated from US institutions who've lived here for most of their lives to be able to work in their field is in the public interest. But now it's in writing. So consular officers see specifically that if they have this fact pattern, they should recommend the waiver to CBP and they should request an expedite.
Right. Okay. So both maybe a higher likelihood that the waiver will be recommended based on these factors and an expedite that it be done, but it still has to go to CBP. So what about CBP? Are they going to update their guidance as well?
Well, CBP does not have the same kind of public-facing guidance that the State Department does. CBP is is a partner here. They're in consultation with state. We've met with state. We will be meeting with CBP to talk about this. But I hope that they will be following the recommendation of, in general, if a consular officer recommends a waiver based on their own guidance, CBP will generally do that, and CBP will generally expedite if a consular officer recommends. I think one question over time would be workload. I don't know. At the moment, it will take time for this to ramp up. Even if somebody wanted to start today, unless they have an employer who's already filed a visa petition hoping this would happen, it will take time. It'll take time to have these kind of conversations, to screen the individual, to have conversations with the employer, for the employer to file an application, for the individual to make an application abroad. So I would expect not to be seeing any kind of higher volume probably till early next year. And I hope that CBP would be able to keep up with that, with whatever volume there is.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the challenges here. I mean, first of all, the fact that there is any process at all that might allow somebody who has DACA or has been undocumented to get into a legal status, I think that's something that a lot of Americans would approve of. But, as you mentioned, there's a lot of steps along the way. This D3 waiver happens kind of almost toward the end of the process, right? You mentioned you have to have a degree. You have to be sponsored by an employer for one of these non-immigrant visas. Let's just talk about the H-1B right now. H-1B has a cap. There's only so many H-1B visas issued each year unless you're working for a nonprofit organization or research organization. So is that a functional limit on sort of how many people could possibly benefit from this? I mean, the H-1B also has requirements about the occupation has to be related to your degree. I mean, it's not just like snap your fingers, you can get a work visa. Am I right?
Exactly. I mean, I'm excited about this because it gives me one more tool in the toolbox. It does not, only Congress can fix this problem by passing a DREAM Act, but we're finding that, at least a third, if not more, of individuals that we talk to have a possibility of using this D3 process. And so for some, if they're younger, like if I just talked to somebody this morning who is a sophomore computer science major, she was kind of giving up a little bit. She doesn't have DACA. She's undocumented. What's the point of finishing school if I won't be able to work? There now is some incentive for her to do well in her classes, but also to network because, to talk to her professors, to do informational interviews with alums and try to get herself in a position where we can try to help her in a couple of years leverage her first job into moving back into status and being able to work. So it is not a panacea. It's not a overall fix. But it's certainly the most important tool that we have added to our toolbox since DACA. And I think particularly because most people in higher education now don't have DACA and can't work when they graduate, it's particularly timely.
Yeah, yeah. So there's lots of conversations that have to happen between the individual a potential employer or an employer. I think we should be clear that if someone doesn't have DACA, which grants employment authorization, or another status like TPS that would grant employment authorization, an employer can't hire them right away until they get one of these non-immigrant visas. So that, we have to make sure that people understand that the application itself doesn't get you anything. You have to get to the end of the process.
Exactly. And part of what we're trying to do through our project is to talk to everybody in their own language. So we're trying to talk to employers about what this might mean, about whether this may be another pool of talent in a tight labor market that they may be able to access, but it will take some changes to their workflow in talent acquisition. We're talking to universities about trying to get the word out to their students. We're talking to DACA individuals. So really trying to help everybody understand this from their own angle. And I will just say, Theresa, just quickly, the point you made about nonprofits and colleges and universities being exempt from the H-1B lottery, in some interesting ways, gives them a leg up in recruiting, because we're talking about a pool of over
that's
a million
already
people.
There.
Yeah. So if I'm a software engineer in the Bay Area and I can make more money at Microsoft and I have DACA, but a local nonprofit will sponsor me to move into status, that's interesting.
Right, because that can get them into a legal status from whence they could then maybe later move to another employer or go have somebody sponsor them from a green card. Once you have that legal non-immigrant status, other opportunities present themselves that you don't have from DACA, correct?
Exactly.
Yeah, from an immigration standpoint. We're not talking
Yes.
career advice here. We're just talking from an immigration standpoint. So you talked a little bit about this. How do you describe the mood among your colleagues, advocates for DACA and Dreamers? Do they feel like it's a big step, or are they still trying to kind of get their arms around what this means?
Both. I think they're certainly trying to get their arms around what it means. If any of your listeners are still scratching their heads a little bit about how this all works, you're not the only ones. But it is exciting because, again, I've been practicing long enough to have been working with colleges and universities pre-DACA. And I remember my very first case was an economics major who graduated from an Ivy League institution with a bachelor's degree and had an offer from Goldman Sachs and was unable to work. She ended up doing, babysitting and landscaping for a few years until we found something else for her. So, and in a way, we're back at that moment because DACA is not available as a new option. So I think people are excited. I know some people are saying DACA 2.0 just because it's the same number of people. It's not really, but it's a very, very significant step forward, and I'm excited about it.
Yeah. I would say, one of the things, obviously, anytime there's any proposal by the administration or anybody else that would allow for a legal pathway for people who don't have status now, someone throws out the amnesty word. I mean, how would you respond to that? Would you call this amnesty?
No, not at all. And I'm not just saying that. I think, first of all, in general, amnesty leads to some kind of permanency. Like the 1986 amnesty, what they called amnesty. But here, what we're talking about is the ability to access a temporary 3-year work visa. So it's not a long-term plan, and we have to work with each person to try to find a long-term plan. But it is short-term. It allows people to, in effect, be excused for having the 3 and 10-year bar. And there's a lot of, just to give you a sense of the way it has been for a long time, it's basically a balancing test to decide if someone should get this waiver, and it always has been, based on the risk of having somebody here, the benefit of having them here, and what they did to put them in this situation.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at the DACA Dreamer population, they tend to come out very well on that balancing test. If there's no criminal issue or there's no risk of having them here, the benefit of having somebody be able to use their U.S. degree for a U.S. employer is a benefit. And then what they did to put themselves in this situation in most of these fact patterns is being brought here as a child, by family. So anyway, that was a longer answer to your question. The basic answer is that this has been around for a long time, but it's only a temporary fix. It does not waive the 3 and 10-year bar for green card purposes. It does not lead definitely to a green card. It allows somebody to work for a temporary period of time to have a bridge to try to figure something else out.
Well, I think it's worth also mentioning that for those who do have DACA, DACA itself is under threat. We know that there's a pending court case in Texas that most people, even staunch immigration advocates, think will go against the program, and the program may end. Certainly, if we have a change of administration, President Trump tried to end the program during his tenure as president. But the H-1B is in law, and someone has H-1B status. That's not going to go away by an executive order. Um, so it's a little more certainty for people, even if it's not a long term. It's at least a little bit more certainty. Is that would you characterize that as accurate?
Absolutely. And I think in addition, I think one other worry about DACA is that unlike many kinds of work cards, a DACA work card is not extended just by filing the renewal. So this year we saw quite a few people lose their jobs because their new one card ended and the new card hadn't arrived yet. There is some concern that, in a new administration, some things could slow down, and that could happen more often. But yes, absolutely. The H-1B is a status, and that word status is incredibly important in immigration. A status would allow somebody to pursue a green card from the U.S. instead of abroad. And what we've seen from the Supreme Court and just in general is that I have much more ability to help somebody when they're physically in the U.S. in status than when they're processing outside the U.S. at a consulate.
Right. So we talked about some of the, maybe challenges of going through this process. It's not necessarily straightforward. What would you tell people who are going to try to explain this to other people? Hopefully they listen to this podcast, but someone who is a dreamer, who is going to talk to an employer, or somebody who is an employer who's going to try to talk to their, bosses about this. What kind of tips would you tell them about how to try to talk about this and or broach this topic?
Sure. Well, for the dreamers, I would say two things. One is try to get a screening. If you've had a screening before, do it again. And now that there's a lot more training out about employer-sponsored options, and those screenings look for everything. So again, this is one tool in the toolbox, but we are finding through screening people for employer-sponsored options that there are other things. Immigration's complicated. I know I'm sure that's a theme of your podcast, and
Lots.
And so sometimes we do find something else that could help them. So get a screening, and then in terms of for employers, what we're trying to do is to say this is another way that you can grow and support your workforce. Some employers want to do this, out of the goodness of their hearts. Some employers want to do this because they're having trouble finding the talent they need. Either way, the strategies that you use to reach out and to offer and to consider sponsorship for DACA and undocumented individuals could be used for a lot of other people. There are, I think, 800,000 people on TPS. There are, maybe the same number who are here on various different parole programs from Ukraine and Afghanistan. There are a lot of people, really a historic number of people in the U.S. right now who are not in one of those statuses like H-1B or L-1 or green card. That's a potential workforce, and understanding, sort of rethinking your immigration sponsorship policy and your outreach and your messaging and the way you're talking to your talent acquisition folks can help you recruit and retain the people you need.
Yeah. So we've talked about a whole lot of stuff here. I mean, you're focusing a lot. I know you personally are focusing a lot on this right now, not just the effort to get the administration to do it, but now getting the word out, to helping people understand it. Thank you for being on the podcast to help us understand it. What do you think is next, for this program or for others like it? What would you like to see sort of the next set of policy and law changes that you think would be most urgent in helping the most people here?
I think some clarification on which other visas are possible in this case based on temporary intent, I think would be very helpful. Again, this was a big step. I just want to give the administration a lot of credit for doing something big and complicated in a short time. I think it would be possible perhaps to add on the spouses of these individuals as eligible for waivers. So, for example, if I'm an H-1B worker and I can travel with my spouse and my spouse were able to come back as H-4, that would be a step forward. The President's Parole in Place program, which was the other piece of this, does allow stepchildren, so it thinks about dependents. I think that might be another step. And then I think really just making sure that this continues to work efficiently.
Mhm.
We've always said
Process matters. Policy
oh,
is important, but
absolutely.
process matters. If you can't
Yeah,
process it, the policy is kind of irrelevant. So,
exactly. I mean, if in 6 months these things are still taking days or weeks instead of months, then that's a very big step forward, and I hope so. I hope that will happen.
well, thank you, Dan, for this. It's been very helpful. I know I had some questions, and I'm somebody who thinks I know a lot about immigration, and even I had some questions. So thank you for clearing it up. Where can people find more information about this? You mentioned getting screenings. Where would you recommend people go to look for that information and screenings? What are some websites that you would send them to?
I will say our Cornell program is based right now in the Bay Area of California. There are free screenings available at path2papers.org. There are a variety of other organizations, including the President's Alliance on Higher Education and Immigration on their higher ed portal. There's a lot of good information. And most of the big DACA organizations are in the process of setting up screening tools. So stay tuned. But if you go to path2papers.org or the President's Alliance Higher Ed portal, you'll find all sorts of links and resources.
Great. Thank you so much for being with us on This Week in Immigration, Dan.
Thank you very much. A pleasure.
We're going to take a short break, but when we come back, Jack Malde and I are going to discuss recent changes in the presidential race and how it could impact immigrants and immigration policy. So don't go anywhere.
This month has seen several significant developments in the presidential race. First, on the Democrat side, the first presidential debates on June 27th seemed to provoke more polarized opinions within the party regarding President Biden's preparedness to compete with Donald Trump this fall. Eventually, on July 21st, Biden announced the termination of his presidential campaign and endorsed Vice President Kamala Harris to run for president. While it isn't certain, it looks increasingly likely that Harris will secure the Democratic nomination, and the media is rife with speculation on who Harris's running mate will be.
So, just a month ago in our podcast episode on the recent Mexican elections and the victory there of Claudia Sheinbaum, the first Mexican female president elected, we were very quickly to say that on the U.S. side, that she would have to work with what seemed to be a man, and a man for whom it wouldn't be their first presidential term, whether it be Joe Biden or Donald Trump. But suddenly there's a chance for a female president-elect to the north of the U.S.-Mexico border.
And moving to the Republican side, on July 15th, Donald Trump finally chose his running mate, J.D. Vance, a junior senator from Ohio. Trump then secured his nomination at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, with immigration featuring as a hot topic. So, Theresa, we got a lot to get through. Let's get on with it. We can start with Kamala Harris, who's been serving as vice president in President Biden's administration for the last 3.5 years. Briefly, how would you describe Biden's immigration policy and politics, and what was Kamala Harris's role in all that?
So I think we've covered that a lot on this podcast, but just to kind of reiterate, President Biden ran in 2019 and 2020 on a set of immigration policies that were sort of directly in opposition to what were seen as some of the harshest policies that President Trump put in place. Things like the so-called Muslim ban, the policies of separating kids and families at the border, the Remain in Mexico program at the U.S.-Mexico border, which forced migrants to wait in Mexico for asylum hearings, increasing crackdowns on immigration inside the country, as deportation efforts, and certainly harsh rhetoric around immigration. So Biden came in with, I think, a much more progressive immigration policy, if you will, definitely more immigrant friendly. And one of the issues he ran on was, rather than trying to increase deterrence of migrants at the border, he wanted to address the so-called root causes of migration from what was then the biggest group of people coming from the Northern Triangle countries of Central America, which were El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And so in 2021, he issued a series of executive orders very early in his presidency to undo some of President Trump's policies. And he asked Kamala Harris to take point on and run his administration's efforts at what they called the root causes strategy, which meant dealing from a diplomatic and development perspective with addressing the so-called push factors from migration. And those are things like crime and governance, rule of law, poverty, lack of opportunity. So it was a combination of bilateral relationships with the governments in those areas, both to increase their own border security, but also to create investment opportunities, working with USAID, getting private sector commitments to invest money in those countries to help create jobs. That was her role. Of course, we've seen the Biden administration pivot, particularly in the last year and a half, with regard to the border, to more, some say, Trump-like policies about restricting access to asylum at the border, asking Mexico to do more to prevent the migrants from coming up through Mexico to the border. And that seems to have been having an effect. We have seen migration go down in the last few months from the record high it was in December of 2023. But we also should take note that the countries that Kamala Harris was directed to work with, those countries of the Northern Triangle of Central America, no longer represent nearly as large a proportion of the migrants we're seeing at the border. They're coming from a lot more countries, lots more from South America, especially Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Haiti, but also more than 100 countries around the world. So that root causes strategy, which was aimed at what was then sort of this large number of migrants from a particular area, probably is a little less relevant today, only for dealing with the border, only because the migration is from so many other places.
And some people have been calling Kamala Harris the border czar.
Yeah.
I'm not actually sure if I'm saying that word correctly. Is that accurate?
I think that's not accurate. Look, I think Republicans have tried for a very long time to make the state of the border under President Biden a liability, particularly from a political standpoint. And Republicans in the House, since they took back the House 2 years ago, have been hearing after hearing after hearing about Biden's border crisis. And one of the pieces of that is saying, well, Kamala Harris was supposed to be the border czar and solve all this, and she didn't. The fact of the matter is, no, Kamala Harris was not named the border czar. Matter of fact, her remit really didn't have anything to do with the border itself. It was this sort of development and diplomatic effort with those countries to reduce the push factors. The border is and remains the province of the Secretary of Homeland Security, who, to be clear, has faced his own share of criticism from Republicans in Congress, including an impeachment effort over the management of the border. But I think it's not accurate to call her a border czar. And it should be noted that there is no such title in the federal government of border czar. The moniker of czar is sort of a shorthand for anyone in an executive branch who's sort of put in charge of a large issue area to come up with policy solutions to work across the federal government. And doing that, it's a thing that the media applies, but there is no formal role that's called a czar in the US government. I think it's worth reminding people of that.
So prior to becoming vice president, Kamala Harris held several other public positions. She was U.S. District Attorney in San Francisco, Attorney General of the state of California, and a senator from California when she ran for the Democratic nomination for president in 2019, before finally becoming Joe Biden's running mate and vice president. We also know that she's a daughter of immigrants to the United States from India and Jamaica. So, with all that having been said, do we know much about where Kamala Harris stands on immigration issues, and how closely aligned is she with President Biden?
So I'm going to take that last part first, because I think it's worth looking into that a little bit. It has been a long time since a sitting vice president was running for president when the president they served under is still in office. I think Al Gore and Bill Clinton were the last time we saw that happen, because Joe Biden did not opt to run in 2020. In 2016. So this presents a little bit of an issue. As I mentioned, Kamala Harris is part of the Biden administration. She is his partner, on the ticket. She was, until recently, his running mate. Now she leads the ticket. She has an opportunity to say where she might do things differently than President Biden. But at the end of the day, I think it's going to be very hard for her to say, oh, the things President Biden did were not things that I would have agreed with, because that would make it seem like she either wasn't involved at all or disagreed with things that the president did. So I think this is a little bit of a tightrope she's going to have to walk. People are trying to read the tea leaves from where she was when she had all of those previous positions, or when she herself ran for president or ran for the Democratic nomination in 2019. I think it's worth saying that back then, first of all, she came from the San Francisco Bay Area, which everyone knows is a very, very progressive liberal area of California, which is a progressive liberal state for the most part. And so her positions tended to reflect that, but she was a prosecutor. So I would say that she had a pretty much relatively tough on crime image. When she was Attorney General of California, however, she supported the law that was passed in California called the Trust Act that protected localities under sanctuary laws. So that's something that I imagine Republicans might take issue with. In 2019, she and many other of the Democratic candidates supported broadly, for example, decriminalizing border crossings. There was a Democratic primary debate where they were asked about whether or not they supported that policy. She initially indicated she did, and then sort of seemed to step back. And I think it was unclear by the time she dropped out of the race. But I think, the Democratic politics of the time were very much, wherever Trump is, we're the exact opposite. But if you look at the Biden-Harris administration, certainly what they ran on in 2020 and where they are today is a different place. And so it's quite possible that in her time in the vice president's office and seeing what it's like to actually try to implement policies that have effect on immigration and border, she may have shifted her views. And I think that's going to be important for her to delineate as she tries to campaign. But it is worth saying that as the first generation daughter of immigrants, she has a personal stake in this too. And that may well impact, some of her policy decisions going forward.
So the media is actively trying to guess who Kamala Harris will choose as her vice president candidate. There are quite a few, including Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear, Arizona Senator Mark Kelly, Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo, Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, Maryland Governor Wes Moore, Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper, Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker, and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. And there might be others as well. So it's a very long list. Obviously, not all of these candidates have had to deal with immigration in their political careers, but do we know if any of them have ever showed a specific interest in immigration policy?
Well, here's what I think of that list. The most obvious name for immigration purposes that jumps out is Senator Mark Kelly from Arizona. Arizona being a border state, he himself, people obviously probably have heard of his counterpart, Senator Kyrsten Sinema from Arizona, as being the person more engaged, particularly on a bipartisan basis in recent efforts. But Mark Kelly has also had a lot to say about the border, and I think is probably, like a lot of Democrats in border states and on the border, a little bit more moderate when it comes to some of these policies, because he and his constituents want to see the border regulated and orderly. So, I think the others maybe have had less to say about immigration specifically. So, it kind of remains to be seen. Look, the choice of a vice president is a very important one for any presidential candidate. What's unique here is that Vice President Harris, one, has gone through it herself, so she kind of knows what that process should look like, but she has a very short period of time in which to select somebody. And so that means expedited vetting. That means looking for somebody who's already sort of has enough of a vetting process that's been done in some other candidate that she can kind of adopt. And obviously there's all the political considerations. Who is going to help balance out the ticket? Who's going to be more likely to bring along voters that they need to persuade to win the presidency? Like all of those things. I don't know how she's going to end up picking, but I think it'll be interesting to see, given that both President Biden, when he was vice president, had this similar role of dealing with the Central American countries on migration under President Obama. He tasked that to Vice President Harris. Would she look to do a similar thing with whoever her vice president candidate would be and say, oh, would you task that person with dealing with it? And that may influence, if she intends to do that, that may influence her pick. Regardless, by the time this episode comes out, maybe we'll know who her vice president is, if not probably shortly thereafter. And then we can look at that person and see what policies they may support.
Okay, so moving to the Republican side, Trump chose his vice presidential candidate, his running mate, junior senator from Ohio, J.D. Vance. What do we know about his views on immigration.
So J.D. Vance is relatively a political newcomer. He got his first elected office when he was elected to the Senate in 2022 from Ohio. Most people knew J.D. Vance as an author of a very well-selling book called Hillbilly Elegy about sort of a memoir of his life growing up in Ohio and his connections to the Appalachian regions of Kentucky from his grandparents. And it was seen as sort of a homage to a lot of the people that President Trump, frankly, has courted throughout his political career. Folks who feel sort of left out by the globalization, by the increasing disparities between the haves and the have-nots, if you will, in our country. A lot of folks from rural areas in America who have become the base of the Trump Republican Party. In the years since when he ran in Ohio, he has absolutely embraced sort of that Trumpian policy and view. What he has said about immigration tends to reflect a lot of the same things that President Trump has said, that immigrants are a drain on American resources, they're competition for jobs and in the economy, lower wages, bring crime. So he is very much on board. But it is worth noting that before he ran in the Ohio Senate race and when Trump was running in 2016, he was not a fan of President Trump and he considered himself a never Trumper. So he's not the only Republican to have been in that camp to kind of come around to President Trump. And certainly President Trump probably wouldn't have picked him as his vice presidential candidate if he didn't think that he was alongside. But that is an evolution in I think, a relatively short period of time.
Okay, and we had the Republican National Convention from July 15th to July 18th. How important was immigration on the agenda at that convention, and what can we realistically expect from a Trump administration if he should win the election in November?
So, a couple of big kind of immigration stories out of the Republican National Convention. The first is the Republican platform. So, every major party, most years, comes together with all of its party delegates and votes on a platform of policies that they want all of their candidates, particularly the presidential candidate, to implement. It's sort of their game plan, their promises of what they want to try to do should they be elected. When President Trump ran in 2020, he told the Republican National Convention, "I don't need a platform to run on. People have seen me in office. I'm going to continue the policies I believe in." And so there wasn't one, but there was again a platform this year. But he took a very heavy hand in that, and the platform was, I think, very light on specifics, but very heavy on the kinds of themes that we've seen President Trump, former President Trump, talk about in his campaign rallies. The biggest ones are related to the mass deportation campaign, which he has promised to initiate should he be reelected to president, and building a wall at the border, securing the southern border, you know, stopping immigration at the border, as he said, day one. So that was part of the campaign platform. And then, of course, there were themes for each day of the Republican National Convention. One day was on keeping America safe, and that on that day, there was a lot of speeches about the harms of immigration, how immigrants are creating criminality in the country, highlighting the cases of murders committed by undocumented immigrants. But most notably, there were signs printed up that many of the delegates were holding during these speeches calling for mass deportation now. And I think, that is something that clearly is a centerpiece on immigration for Trump's reelection campaign, in addition to criticizing President Biden and now Vice President Harris on their handling of the border. He's leaning into this idea of mass deportation. He has said he wants to mobilize the military, not just the National Guard, but active duty military inside the United States and state and local police to round up undocumented immigrants, put them in concentration camps, and deport them as soon as possible. So this is really obviously a very massive step up. He says the largest deportation campaign since Operation Wet Pack, which was the unfortunate name of an operation during the Eisenhower administration to deport Mexicans from the United States after the end of the Bracero program. So this is a highly controversial thing. Obviously, a lot of Democrats don't like it. Immigration advocates don't like it. But I think it's important to recognize that there are real legal, logistical impediments to that kind of operation happening in the United States. Not the least of which is that we have something called the Posse Comitatus Act, a law passed by Congress that says active duty military cannot engage in law enforcement duties inside the United States unless there is an act of war declared. So set that aside, or invasion. And we have heard some Republicans, including the governor of Texas, use that term with regard to immigration. So I would, put a pin in that, because that may be something, a way the president tries to do this is by saying we actually have an invasion. State and local law enforcement are not under the control of the federal government, are not able to be federalized. So you'd have to have states and localities willing to allow and officers to do that kind of work. And, it's not inexpensive to do this the way he's talking about. Will Congress allocate resources to do it? If not, where will he get the resources from? And of course, the idea and vision of camps in the United States rounding up immigrants, there's lots of echoes of history there, whether you're looking at Japanese internment during World War II or what happened in Germany, that I think a lot of Americans have at least a little bit of uncomfortableness, if not more. So, it certainly is a very visceral kind of proposal. His supporters love it. They were chanting, during the Republican convention. But I think that is certainly one area that voters in the fall will have to look at if immigration is important to them, to say, is this the direction we want to go? I will note that President Trump, when he was president, did find pushback for some of his more extreme policies, including the separation of families and children. So it's not inconceivable that even if he were to be elected, if he tried to do this, he would face a lot of pushback from the public.
Okay, well, thank you, Theresa, for taking us through that. I think we'll leave it there for this week. But yeah, thanks again.
Thanks. I'm glad we could talk this out. Probably more to come for sure.
And that's a wrap on this episode of This Week in Immigration. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find our podcast episodes on the Bipartisan Policy Center YouTube channel. You can find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on the X platform at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow Theresa Cardinal Brown at BPC_T Brown, and you can follow me at Jack Malde. Send your comments and feedback to us by email to immigration@bipartisanpolicy.org. I'm Jack Malde. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This episode was written by myself, Rennie Mockery, and Theresa Cardinal Brown. Joshua Joe is our audio editor. The executive producer of BPC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. Talk to you next time on This Week in Immigration.